They looked right through me like I was invisible, dismissing my words with the kind of cold indifference reserved for people they deemed unworthy of their time. The security guard's eyes followed my every movement as if I were planning a heist, while the tellers whispered behind their bulletproof glass. Little did they know I was Dr. Maya Washington, the woman who had just been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of America's most influential scientists, the same woman who had dedicated her life to finding cures that would save millions of lives, including theirs. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Dr. Maya Washington, and I've spent the last 20 years of my life in laboratories, research facilities, and medical conferences across this great nation. At 42, I've published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, hold 17 patents in biotechnology, and have been honored with the Presidential Medal of Science. My work in cancer research has led to breakthrough treatments that have extended the lives of thousands of patients worldwide, earning me recognition from medical institutions across 6 continents. I live in a beautiful colonial home in Westchester County, New York with my husband Marcus, who's a federal judge, and our twin daughters, Zoe and Sage, both honor students at their private academy. Our home sits on 3 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds, complete with a tennis court and a swimming pool where we host annual fundraisers for medical research. We're what many would call a successful American family living the dream that so many of our ancestors fought and died for. My journey to this point wasn't easy. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, the daughter of a seamstress and a mechanic. My parents, James and Ruth Washington, worked 3 jobs between them to ensure I could attend college. They never missed a parent-teacher conference, never failed to encourage my love of science, and never let me believe that my dreams were too big for a little black girl from the South. I earned my undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Spelman College, graduating summa cum laude before heading to Harvard Medical School. The transition from the nurturing environment of a historically black college to the predominantly white halls of Harvard was jarring. I was one of only 12 black students in my class of 160, and I quickly learned that excellence wasn't just expected, it was required for survival. During my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, I specialized in oncology, drawn to the field by my grandfather's death from lung cancer when I was 15. I watched this strong man who had built houses with his bare hands and raised 7 children during the height of segregation, waste away because he couldn't afford proper medical care. I vowed then that I would dedicate my life to ensuring that no family would have to watch their loved one suffer for lack of resources or research. My breakthrough came during my fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I developed a targeted therapy for pediatric leukemia that increased survival rates by 60%. The research caught the attention of pharmaceutical companies worldwide, and by the time I was 35, I was appointed chief of oncology at New York Presbyterian Hospital, the youngest person and first black woman to hold the position. But success, I've learned, doesn't shield you from the harsh realities of being a black woman in America. It doesn't protect you from the assumptions, the microaggressions, or the moments when your humanity is questioned simply because of the color of your skin. No matter how many degrees hang on your wall, how many lives you've saved, or how many accolades you've received, there are still people who will look at you and see only what they expect to see, and what they expect is never good enough. This story takes place on a Tuesday morning in September, a crisp autumn day that painted the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. I had just returned from a medical conference in Geneva, where I presented my latest research on targeted cancer therapies to an audience of the world's leading oncologists. The presentation was met with a standing ovation, and 3 pharmaceutical companies had already reached out about licensing my patents. The European Union had also expressed interest in funding a multi-million-dollar research initiative based on my findings. I was riding high on the success, feeling grateful for the opportunities America had given me to pursue my passion for healing. My phone had been buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues around the world, and the medical journal Nature had confirmed that my latest paper would be featured on their cover next month. It felt like everything I had worked for was finally coming together. That morning, I needed to make what I thought would be a simple transaction at my bank. I had been banking with Meridian Trust for over 15 years, ever since Marcus and I bought our first home together. It was more than just a business relationship. I had recommended the bank to colleagues, attended their annual charity galas, and even served on their customer advisory board for 2 years. I knew the branch manager personally, or at least I thought I did. The transaction I needed to complete was significant but routine for someone in my position. I needed to wire $2.8 million to Johns Hopkins University to fund a new research initiative focused on developing treatments for rare pediatric cancers. The money represented a combination of speaking fees from my recent lecture tour, royalties from my patents, and a generous grant I had received from the Gates Foundation for my work in global health equity. This wasn't my first large transaction with the bank. Over the years, I had funded scholarships for underprivileged students, donated to medical research facilities, and even purchased a second home in Martha's Vineyard. Each transaction had been handled with professionalism and efficiency. I had no reason to expect this one would be any different. I dressed professionally that morning as I always do, a tailored navy blazer from my favorite boutique in Manhattan, a crisp white silk blouse, and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, a woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families in Alabama but always told me that education was the key to freedom. She had saved every penny to buy those pearls, believing that one day her granddaughter would wear them in places she could only dream of. I carried my leather briefcase, the same one I'd taken to meetings with CEOs and Nobel laureates, to dinners at the White House, and to speaking engagements at universities around the world. Inside were not just the documents I needed for the wire transfer, but also copies of my latest research, letters from patients whose lives I'd helped save, and photos from my recent Time magazine cover shoot. The bank was located in the heart of our affluent neighborhood, nestled between a high-end boutique and an art gallery that featured works by local artists. It was a place where million-dollar homes were the norm, where luxury cars lined the streets, and where I had conducted business countless times before. I knew most of the staff by name, or at least I thought I did. But on this particular morning, I was about to discover that familiarity doesn't always breed respect, and that success doesn't always shield you from the harsh realities of racial prejudice. As I pulled into the parking lot in my silver Mercedes-Benz, I noticed a young black man in the car next to me quickly rolling up his windows and avoiding eye contact. It was a look I recognized, the careful wariness of someone who understood that being black in certain spaces required a different kind of vigilance. I wished I could tell him that it would get easier, that success would insulate him from judgment, but I was about to learn that lesson myself all over again. I walked into the marble-floored lobby of Meridian Trust at precisely 10:30 a.m., my heels clicking against the polished stone with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The bank's interior was a study in understated elegance. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany paneling, and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. Classical music played softly in the background, creating an atmosphere of refined prosperity. The bank was bustling with morning activity, well-dressed professionals conducting their business, elderly clients discussing estate planning with financial advisors, and young couples applying for mortgages. The soft murmur of financial transactions created a familiar symphony of commerce that I had heard hundreds of times before. I approached the customer service desk where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a nameplate reading Jessica Martinez was typing on her computer. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, impeccably dressed in a conservative black suit with minimal jewelry. When she looked up at me, I noticed her smile, the kind of practiced expression that customer service representatives perfect, but something in her eyes suggested it was more performance than genuine warmth. "Good morning," I said warmly, setting my briefcase down beside me and extending the same courtesy I would to anyone. "I hope you're having a wonderful day. I need to speak with someone about arranging a wire transfer for my research foundation." Jessica's smile faltered slightly as she took in my appearance. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, lingering on my face with an expression I knew all too well. It was the look of someone trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected to see in this space. The pause was brief but unmistakable, that moment of cognitive dissonance that occurs when reality doesn't match preconceived notions. Okay," she said slowly, her voice taking on a tone that was both patronizing and cautious. "What kind of amount are we talking about here? Our wire transfer services start with a minimum of $500, and there are various fees associated with different types of transactions. We also have daily limits for security purposes." I maintained my composure, though I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. This was not how she had greeted the previous customer, a middle-aged white man who had requested a similar service without being questioned about amounts or limits. "I need to wire $2.8 million to Johns Hopkins University for a research grant I'm funding." Jessica's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline, and she let out a small, incredulous laugh that seemed to escape before she could stop it. "I'm sorry, did you say $2.8 million? "Yes, that's correct," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing tension I felt in my chest. She glanced around the lobby as if looking for backup or perhaps checking to see if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Her reaction was drawing attention from other customers, and I could feel their eyes beginning to turn in our direction. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification, and we'll need to verify your account information thoroughly." Large transactions like this require additional security measures and management approval. I understood the need for security. Banks deal with fraud attempts daily, and large transactions naturally require verification. But something in her tone, the way she emphasized large transactions like this, suggested this was more than routine protocol. The skepticism in her voice was palpable, and I noticed she hadn't mentioned these same security measures to other customers conducting substantial transactions. Still, I maintained my professionalism. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my driver's license and my platinum banking card, the one reserved for their highest-tier customers with accounts exceeding $1 million. I also provided my secondary identification, a medical license that clearly identified me as Dr. Maya Washington. Jessica examined my IDs with the intensity of a forensic scientist, holding them up to the light and comparing the photos to my face multiple times. She even used a special pen to check for counterfeiting, something I noticed she hadn't done for previous customers. Dr. Maya Washington, she read aloud, her voice carrying a note of skepticism that suggested she doubted the authenticity of my credentials. And you're saying you have $2.8 million available in your account with us? I'm saying I need to wire $2.8 million from my account. Yes, I corrected patiently. I've been banking here for 15 years and I believe my account history speaks for itself. This is not an unusual transaction for my account. She typed something into her computer, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness as if she were performing some kind of complex investigation rather than a routine account lookup. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, she frowned at the screen. The expression on her face suggested she was seeing something unexpected or problematic. I'm showing some irregularities here, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if she were discussing classified information. I'm going to need to get my manager to take a look at this. Irregularities? I asked, my voice steady despite the growing tension I felt. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. What kind of irregularities? I've had this account for 15 years without any issues. Just stay here please, she said, not answering my question. She got up from her desk with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the situation and walked toward the back offices, leaving me standing there like a suspect rather than a customer. I noticed that other customers were beginning to stare. The whispers started as soft murmurs but gradually became more audible. A middle-aged white man in an expensive Armani suit, who had arrived after me, was already being helped by another teller. I watched as he conducted what appeared to be a similarly large transaction, discussing investment transfers and international wire services, with ease and smiles. The teller even offered him coffee and asked about his upcoming vacation to Europe. An elderly woman with her poodle in a designer Louis Vuitton carrier was at another window, conducting what I could overhear was a substantial international transfer to what sounded like a Swiss bank account. The transaction was being processed with cheerful efficiency, complete with detailed explanations of exchange rates and transfer times. But I stood there, waiting, watching, feeling the weight of every stare and whisper. The knot in my stomach tightened as I realized what was happening. This wasn't about security protocols or account verification. This was about something much more fundamental and much more painful. Minutes passed, 10, then 15, then 20. I checked my Rolex, a gift from my husband on our 10th wedding anniversary, and realized I had been waiting longer than some customers took to complete their entire banking visit. My phone buzzed with a text from my research assistant asking about the Hopkins transfer, reminding me that time was of the essence for this particular funding deadline. When Jessica finally returned, she was accompanied by a heavy-set man in his 50s wearing a tie that was slightly too tight for his neck and a suit that had seen better days. His name tag identified him as Brad Morrison, branch manager, and his expression suggested he was approaching a problem that needed to be handled carefully. Mrs. Washington, he said, deliberately omitting my doctoral title despite having my medical license in front of him, I'm Brad Morrison, the branch manager. I understand you're trying to access a large sum of money from your account. The way he phrased it, trying to access, made it sound like I was attempting something illicit rather than conducting legitimate business. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my grandmother's lessons about maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect. I'm Dr. Washington, I corrected gently but firmly, and I'm not trying to access money from my account. I'm trying to wire money from my account to Johns Hopkins University for a legitimate research grant. This is a standard transaction that I've conducted many times before, and one that falls well within my account limits and banking history. Brad's smile was even more condescending than Jessica's had been. It was the kind of smile that suggested he was dealing with someone who didn't quite understand how banking worked. Right, well, Dr. Washington, I'm sure you understand that we have to be very careful with these types of transactions. There's been a lot of fraud lately, particularly with impersonation schemes, and we need to make sure everything is completely legitimate. Of course, I said, though I noticed he hadn't mentioned fraud concerns with the other customers conducting large transactions. What specific verification do you need from me that isn't already in your system? Well, first, I need to understand the source of these funds, he said, his tone taking on the quality of an interrogation. Where exactly did $2.8 million come from? That's a substantial amount of money, and we need to ensure it wasn't obtained through any questionable means. I felt my face grow warm with a combination of embarrassment and anger. This was not a question they were legally required to ask for a wire transfer from my own account, and we both knew it. The money had been in my account for months, some of it for years. This was harassment pure and simple. The funds are from my research grants, patent royalties, speaking fees, and consulting income, I explained, my voice remaining professional despite my growing frustration. All of which are well documented in my account history, my tax returns, and my financial records that you have on file. Brad nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. He looked at me as if I had just claimed to be a princess from a foreign country. And you're saying you're some kind of scientist? The question hit me like a physical blow. I'm an oncologist and researcher, I said, my voice steady despite the pain of having to justify my very existence. I'm the chief of oncology at New York Presbyterian Hospital and a professor at Columbia University Medical School. I hold 17 patents in biotechnology and have been featured in numerous medical journals. Last month, I was on the cover of Time magazine for my contributions to cancer research. Jessica whispered something to Brad, and he nodded gravely, as if they were discussing national security rather than a routine banking transaction. The conversation was clearly about me, and their body language suggested they had already reached some kind of conclusion. Look, Dr. Washington, Brad said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I'm going to need to make some phone calls to verify this information. This kind of transaction requires additional oversight, and I need to confirm your identity and the legitimacy of these funds. Can you come back tomorrow afternoon? Come back tomorrow? I repeated, feeling the eyes of other customers on me. The lobby had grown quieter, with people pretending to focus on their own business while clearly listening to our conversation. I've been banking here for 15 years. My account information, employment history, and financial records are all in your system. Why would I need to come back tomorrow for a routine wire transfer that other customers are completing in minutes? Ma'am, there's nothing routine about a $2.8 million wire transfer, Brad said, his voice carrying a tone of exasperation as if I were being deliberately difficult. Especially when there are questions about. He paused, catching himself before completing the sentence. Especially when what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The silence that followed was deafening. Especially when there are questions about the legitimacy of the funds and the identity of the account holder, he finished, but we both knew that wasn't what he was going to say. We both knew that what he really meant was, especially when the person requesting the transfer is black. I felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who had already decided who I was based on nothing more than the color of my skin. I had faced this kind of discrimination before, in medical school during my residency at professional conferences, but it never got easier. If anything, it got more painful as I achieved more success, because it reminded me that no amount of accomplishment could shield me from the fundamental racism that still infected American society. I see, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. And what specific questions might those be? Brad shifted uncomfortably, loosening his too-tight tie. Behind him, Jessica was fidgeting with her pen, avoiding eye contact. Both of them knew they were on dangerous ground, but they had already committed to their course of action. Look, I don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be, Brad said, his tone suggesting that I was the one making things difficult. But we have policies in place for large transactions and I need to follow them. It's nothing personal, just business. Of course you do, I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions swirling inside me. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what policies exactly require you to question the legitimacy of funds that have been in my account for years? What policies require you to ask a long-time customer to come back tomorrow for a routine transaction that other customers are completing without question? What policies allow you to treat a customer with suspicion and disrespect based on assumptions about their background? The lobby had grown noticeably quiet. Other customers were no longer pretending not to listen. I could feel their stares, their whispers, their judgment. At that moment, I wasn't Dr. Maya Washington, a renowned scientist and healer. I wasn't the woman who had been featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at international conferences. I was just another black woman being made to feel like a criminal for having the audacity to exist in a space where others thought I didn't belong. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice," Brad said, glancing around nervously at the growing attention our conversation was attracting. "I'm not raising my voice," I replied calmly, though my heart was racing. "I'm simply asking you to explain why I'm being treated differently than other customers. I have a right to understand why my 15-year banking relationship is suddenly being called into question." "You're not being treated differently," he insisted, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. The lie was so obvious that even he seemed uncomfortable saying it. "Really?" I asked, my voice carrying across the now silent lobby. "Because the gentleman who arrived after me just completed a large international transfer without being asked to prove the legitimacy of his funds. The woman with the poodle just wired money to what appeared to be a Swiss bank account without being asked to return tomorrow with additional documentation. But I, a customer of 15 years with an impeccable banking history, am being treated like a suspect." Jessica stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment but her voice defensive. "Ma'am, maybe you should just come back when you have more documentation. We're just trying to protect you and the bank from potential fraud." "More documentation? For my own money? In my own account? In my own bank?" The phrase hung in the air like an indictment. Protection from fraud, as if the fraud were not their treatment of me, but my very presence in their establishment. The next few minutes felt like hours. I stood there in that marble lobby, surrounded by whispers and stares, feeling smaller and more isolated than I had since I was a child growing up in the South. But this was worse somehow. This was 2024 in New York, in a bank where I had conducted business for 15 years. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be better. I thought about my grandmother, Mama Ruth, who had faced far worse humiliations with grace and dignity. She had been forced to enter through back doors, drink from separate water fountains, and endure daily indignities that would break most people's spirits. But she had survived, thrived even, raising a family and building a life despite the systemic racism that sought to destroy her. I thought about my parents who had worked multiple jobs to send me to college, who had sacrificed their own comfort so that their daughter could have opportunities they could only dream of. They had faced their own battles with discrimination. My father denied promotions because of his race. My mother passed over for teaching positions despite her qualifications. But mostly I thought about my daughters, Zoe and Sage, who would inherit a world where their mother's success still couldn't shield them from the assumption that they didn't belong in spaces of power and privilege. What would I tell them about this moment? How would I explain that their education, their accomplishments, their character could all be dismissed because of the color of their skin? The weight of generational struggle pressed down on me as I stood there, feeling the eyes of strangers judging me, measuring me, finding me wanting despite everything I had achieved. But then I remembered something else my grandmother had taught me. "Baby girl," she used to say, "they can try to make you small, but your spirit is bigger than their hate. Don't you ever let them convince you to shrink." I thought about the choice I had at this moment. I could accept their treatment, come back tomorrow with more documentation for my own money, and perpetuate a system that assumed the worst of people who looked like me. I could smile, apologize for the inconvenience, and quietly endure this humiliation for the sake of keeping the peace. Or I could stand up, not just for myself, but for every black woman who had been made to feel small in spaces where she had every right to be. I could refuse to accept treatment that was unacceptable, and use this moment to shine a light on the everyday racism that most people prefer to ignore. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying across the now silent lobby with a clarity that surprised even me. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." Brad looked relieved, probably assuming I was about to back down and accept their unreasonable demands. "Good, I'm glad you." "The misunderstanding," I continued, cutting him off, "is that you think I'm going to accept this treatment and quietly go away." His face darkened, the mask of customer service politeness finally slipping. "Ma'am, I think you need to calm down." "I am calm," I said, and I was. In fact, I was calmer than I had been since this whole ordeal began. The decision to fight back had brought a sense of clarity and purpose that cut through the anxiety and humiliation I had been feeling. I'm also a customer who has been banking here for 15 years without incident. I'm also a tax-paying citizen who has contributed more to this community than most people could in 10 lifetimes. And I'm also a woman who refuses to be treated like a criminal for the crime of being black in America. "Now you're being dramatic," Jessica said, her voice sharp with irritation. "This has nothing to do with race." "Doesn't it?" I asked, turning to face her directly. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of truth. Tell me, Jessica, how many white customers have you asked to come back tomorrow for routine wire transfers? How many have you questioned about the legitimacy of their funds without cause? How many have you treated with the suspicion and disrespect you've shown me today? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing that any answer would only confirm what we all knew to be true. I thought so, I said, turning back to Brad. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to process my wire transfer today, right now, just like you would for any other customer. Or I'm going to file a complaint with the Federal Reserve about discriminatory banking practices. And then I'm going to contact my attorney about a civil rights lawsuit. And then I'm going to call every news outlet in New York City and tell them exactly how Meridian Trust treats its black customers. Ma'am, there's no need for threats, Brad said, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The confidence he had displayed earlier was beginning to crack. They're not threats, I replied, my voice steady and professional. They're promises. Because I'm not just Dr. Maya Washington, your customer. I'm also Dr. Maya Washington, the woman who was featured on the cover of Time magazine last month. Dr. Maya Washington, who testified before Congress about healthcare innovation. Dr. Maya Washington, who has the phone numbers of senators, Supreme Court justices, and civil rights attorneys in her contacts list. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a copy of the Time magazine with my photo on the cover. The headline read, "The Healer, Dr. Maya Washington's revolutionary cancer research gives hope to millions." I placed it on the counter between us, watching as both Brad and Jessica stared at it in shock. You see, I continued, my voice carrying across the silent lobby, while you were busy assuming I was somehow unworthy of your basic respect, you missed the fact that I'm one of the most recognized scientists in America. While you were questioning my right to access my own money, you forgot to consider that I might be someone with the platform and resources to make sure this never happens to another person. I could see other customers pulling out their phones, some recognizing me from the magazine cover or from the numerous television interviews I'd given over the past month. Others were simply documenting what was clearly becoming a significant incident. The story was about to become very public very quickly. Now, I said, my voice steady and professional, would you like to process my wire transfer, or would you prefer to explain to your corporate headquarters why you discriminated against a customer who happens to be one of the most recognizable scientists in the country? My phone started buzzing with notifications. Word was already beginning to spread on social media, as people in the lobby began posting about what they were witnessing. Hashtag Dear Washington at the bank was about to trend, and Brad Morrison was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Washington, he said, his voice now trembling slightly, please, let me get this sorted out for you right away. There's no need for this to escalate further. Oh, but there is, I said, my voice carrying a weight of determination that surprised even me. You see, this isn't just about me. This is about every black woman who has been made to feel like she doesn't belong in spaces like this. This is about every person of color who has been treated as suspicious simply for existing in predominantly white spaces. This is about a system that assumes the worst of people based on nothing more than the color of their skin. Brad's hands were shaking as he reached for the magazine. He stared at the cover, then at me, then back at the cover, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and dawning horror at the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Washington, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for the confusion. The confusion? I repeated, my voice sharp with controlled anger. Is that what we're calling racial profiling now? Confusion? No, that's not what I meant, he stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Please, let me get this sorted out for you right away. But I wasn't finished. The Time magazine cover was just the beginning. I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out a folder containing documents that told the story of my life's work. Letters of recommendation from Nobel laureates, photographs from my White House visit where I had advised the president on healthcare policy, and news clippings from my recent research breakthrough that had been covered by every major news outlet in the country. Since you seem so concerned about my identity and credentials, I said, spreading the documents across the counter methodically, here's a letter from the President of the United States congratulating me on my contribution to American science and inviting me to serve on the National Science Advisory Board. Here's a photograph from my dinner at the White House last month, where I briefed the cabinet on healthcare innovation. Here's a news article from CNN about my research that has led to a 60% increase in survival rates for children with leukemia. The crowd that had gathered around us was growing larger by the minute. I could see people recognizing me from my recent media appearances, whispering to each other, pulling out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming a significant moment. This was exactly what I had hoped would not happen when I walked into the bank that morning, but it was also exactly what needed to happen. And here, I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to my text messages, is a conversation from yesterday with Senator Williams asking if I'm available to testify before Congress next week about healthcare policy. And here's an email from the Gates Foundation about expanding our global health initiative. And here's a message from the director of the World Health Organization inviting me to speak at their annual conference in Geneva. I continued pulling out documents and photos, each one painting a picture of a life dedicated to service and achievement. There were thank you letters from patients whose lives I had saved, awards from medical institutions around the world, and invitations to speak at the most prestigious universities on 6 continents. Dr. Washington, Brad said desperately, please, let me personally handle your transaction. There's no need for any of this to go further. Oh, but there is, I said calmly, my voice carrying across the now-packed lobby. You see, this isn't just about me. This is about every black woman who has been made to feel like she doesn't belong in spaces like this. This is about every person of color who has been treated as suspicious simply for existing in predominantly white spaces. I turned to address the crowd that had gathered, many of whom were now recording with their phones. My name is Dr. Maya Washington. Many of you might recognize me from recent news coverage about my cancer research or from my appearance on 60 Minutes last month. What you're witnessing here is something that happens to Black Americans every single day in this country. We are presumed guilty, presumed fraudulent, presumed unworthy until we prove otherwise. And sometimes, as you can see, even overwhelming proof isn't enough. A woman in the crowd called out, I saw you on Good Morning America. You're the one who developed the new treatment for childhood leukemia. That's right, I said, nodding to her with a grateful smile. And this morning, I was treated like a criminal for trying to wire money to Johns Hopkins to fund more research that will save children's lives. All because 2 people looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. Another voice from the crowd, this is unbelievable. How can they treat you like this? Because, I replied, my voice steady and clear, racism doesn't recognize achievement. Discrimination doesn't care about degrees or accolades or contributions to society. When some people look at me, they don't see a doctor who has dedicated her life to saving lives. They don't see a scientist who has revolutionized cancer treatment. They see a black woman and they make assumptions based on that alone. My phone started buzzing incessantly with calls and text messages. Word was spreading rapidly on social media, with videos of the encounter being shared thousands of times within minutes. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, and Brad Morrison was beginning to realize that this was about to become a national incident. One of the customers, an elderly gentleman, stepped forward. Dr. Washington, I'm Harold Fleming. I'm a retired professor from Columbia, and I've followed your work for years. What's happening here is absolutely disgraceful. He turned to Brad with the authority of someone used to commanding respect. Mr. Morrison, I've been banking here for 30 years, and I've never seen a customer treated with such disrespect. This woman is a national treasure, and you're treating her like a common criminal. Sir, I appreciate your concern, Brad said, but this is a private matter between the bank and our customer. Nothing private about it now, Professor Fleming replied, gesturing to the crowd of people recording. This is going to be all over the news by tonight, and rightfully so. But then something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. An elderly black woman who had been watching the entire exchange stepped forward. She was elegantly dressed in a way that spoke of both taste and means, with silver hair perfectly styled and kind eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had lived through decades of similar experiences. Excuse me, Dr. Washington, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. I'm Mrs. Dorothy Banks. I believe you know my granddaughter, Aisha Banks. She's one of your research assistants at Columbia. I did know Aisha, a brilliant young woman pursuing her PhD in molecular biology under my mentorship. She was one of the most promising students I had ever worked with, destined for greatness in her own right. Mrs. Banks, yes, Aisha is one of my most promising students. She's going to change the world. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice carrying across the silent lobby with a dignity that commanded respect. Not just for what you've done for my granddaughter and for countless patients around the world, but for what you're doing right now. I'm 83 years old, and I've been fighting this fight since before you were born. I marched with Dr. King, I integrated lunch counters in Birmingham, and I've spent my entire life working to make things better for the next generation. She turned to face Brad and Jessica, her voice taking on the steel of someone who had faced down much worse than a bank manager's prejudice. You should be ashamed of yourselves. This woman has dedicated her life to saving lives, and you treated her like a criminal. But more than that, you treated her the way you would treat any black woman who walked through that door, famous or not. And that's the real problem, isn't it? The crowd murmured in agreement, and I felt tears prick my eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude and solidarity rather than humiliation. Mrs. Banks, I said, my voice thick with emotion, your granddaughter is going to change the world. And she's going to do it in a world where she won't have to tolerate what we've had to tolerate. That's the hope, she said, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. That's always been the hope. But until that day comes, we have to keep fighting. We have to keep speaking up. We have to keep refusing to accept the unacceptable. She looked directly at Brad, her eyes flashing with decades of accumulated righteous anger. Young man, you have no idea who you're dealing with. Dr. Washington isn't just a brilliant scientist. She's part of a long line of black women who have refused to be made small by people like you. And we're not going anywhere. The power of her words reverberated through the lobby. This wasn't just about one incident of discrimination. It was about generations of struggle, about the ongoing fight for dignity and respect, about the refusal to accept second-class treatment in any form. My phone rang and I looked at the caller ID. It was the producer from Good Morning America. Excuse me, I said to Brad, answering the phone. Yes, this is Dr. Washington. Yes, I'm aware the video is going viral. Yes, I'm available for an interview this afternoon to discuss what happened. I hung up and looked at Brad, whose face had gone completely white. That was Good Morning America. They want to interview me about what just happened here. CNN called 5 minutes ago. So did the Washington Post and the New York Times. It seems your little confusion is about to become the lead story on every major news outlet in the country. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in for both Brad and Jessica. This wasn't just an unhappy customer. This was a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. A respected scientist, a national figure, had been discriminated against in their bank, and the entire incident had been captured on dozens of phones and was already spreading across social media. Dr. Washington, Brad said, his voice cracking with desperation, please, I can fix this. Let me personally handle your transaction right now. There's no need for this to go any further. But I was no longer interested in simply completing my transaction. This had become about something much bigger than $2.8 million or a wire transfer to Johns Hopkins. This had become about justice, about accountability, and about making sure that what happened to me wouldn't happen to others. The wire transfer was processed in less than 5 minutes once Brad realized the magnitude of his mistake. But the damage was done, and more importantly, the conversation that needed to be had was finally happening. Within hours, the video of the encounter was trending on every social media platform. #DrWashington at the bank became a rallying cry for people sharing their own stories of discrimination in everyday spaces. The hashtag #BankingWhileBlack emerged as thousands of people, both black and white, shared similar experiences or expressed their outrage at what they had witnessed. News outlets picked up the story with a speed that surprised even me. By evening, I was sitting across from Anderson Cooper on CNN, discussing not just what had happened, but why it mattered and what it represented about the current state of race relations in America. Dr. Washington, Anderson said, his expression serious and concerned, you could have simply accepted their apology and moved on with your life. You're clearly a busy person with important work to do. Why did you choose to make this a public conversation? Because, I said, looking directly into the camera, this isn't about me. I have the privilege of education, success, and a platform. I have the luxury of being able to fight back without fearing for my job or my safety. But there are millions of black women in America who don't have those privileges. They endure this type of treatment every day, at banks, at stores, at their children's schools, at their jobs, in hospitals, in restaurants. They're forced to smile and accept it because they don't have the power to fight back. And what do you hope comes from this? I hope it starts conversations in boardrooms and break rooms about unconscious bias. I hope it makes people examine their own assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces. I hope it makes institutions look at their policies and practices and ask themselves if they're truly treating all customers equally. Most importantly, I hope it empowers other people who face discrimination to speak up and refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. The interview was watched by millions of people, and the response was overwhelming. My social media accounts were flooded with messages of support, stories from people who had faced similar discrimination, and pledges from organizations to do better. But the real changes started happening within days. Meridian Trust's corporate headquarters issued a public apology within 24 hours, acknowledging that I had been subjected to unacceptable treatment and promising a thorough investigation. The CEO called me personally to apologize and to invite me to help them develop better training programs for their employees. Within a week, Meridian Trust announced a comprehensive review of their policies and procedures, mandatory bias training for all employees, and a $2 million donation to organizations fighting financial discrimination. They also established a customer advocate program to ensure that similar incidents would be investigated and addressed immediately. Brad Morrison was quietly transferred to a different branch and required to complete extensive diversity and inclusion training before being allowed to work with customers again. Jessica was enrolled in a mentorship program designed to help employees understand the impact of unconscious bias on customer service. But the changes extended far beyond Meridian Trust. Banks across the country began reviewing their own policies and training programs. The American Bankers Association invited me to speak at their annual conference about creating inclusive banking environments. Several states introduced legislation requiring bias training for employees in customer-facing positions. More importantly, I started receiving messages from Black women across the country sharing their own stories and thanking me for giving them the courage to speak up when they faced similar treatment. Young girls sent me pictures of themselves in science labs, inspired by seeing someone who looked like them refusing to be made small. The Johns Hopkins Research Project was funded without further incident, and 6 months later, our team announced a breakthrough in treating aggressive childhood cancers. The irony wasn't lost on me that the money they had initially refused to wire was now saving the lives of children of all races and backgrounds. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 3 months later, when Aisha Banks defended her doctoral dissertation. As she stood before the panel of distinguished professors, confidently presenting her research on gene therapy, I thought about the chain of courage that had led to this moment, from her grandmother's generation fighting for basic civil rights, to my generation fighting for the right to be treated with dignity in everyday spaces, to Aisha's generation, who would hopefully face fewer barriers but would be prepared to fight when they encountered them. After the defense, Aisha approached me with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Washington, I want to thank you for what you did at the bank. Not just for the principle of it, but for showing me that we don't have to accept poor treatment just because we're Black women in spaces where we're not expected to be. You would have figured that out on your own," I told her, meaning every word. "You're stronger than you know, and you come from a long line of strong women." "Maybe," she said, "but it helps to see someone who looks like me refusing to be made small. It helps to know that success doesn't mean we have to be silent about injustice." 6 months later, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. Meridian Trust asked me to speak at their annual employee conference about diversity, inclusion, and the importance of treating every customer with dignity and respect. They had implemented the changes they promised, and their customer satisfaction scores among minority customers had improved dramatically. I accepted the invitation not because I had forgiven their treatment of me, but because I believed in the possibility of change and growth. Standing before an audience of bank employees, I told them my story not to shame them, but to help them understand the impact of their actions on the people they serve. When you work in customer service, I told them, you have the power to make someone's day better or worse. You have the ability to treat people with dignity and respect, or to make them feel small and unwelcome. The choice you make at that moment says nothing about the customer, it says everything about you. I could see the impact of my words on their faces. These weren't bad people. They were people who had been operating with unconscious biases that they had never been forced to examine. By sharing my story, by making the invisible visible, we were creating the possibility for real change. The bank also established the Dr. Maya Washington Excellence in Customer Service Award, given annually to employees who go above and beyond to ensure that all customers are treated with dignity and respect. While I was honored by the gesture, I was more pleased by what it represented, a commitment to doing better. As I sit here now, reflecting on that day at the bank and everything that followed, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about standing up to discrimination, though that was certainly part of it. The most important lesson was about the power we have to change narratives, to refuse to accept the limitations that others try to place on us, and to use our voices not just for ourselves, but for those who may not have the same opportunities to be heard. I think about my grandmother, Mama Ruth, who cleaned houses for families who never saw her as more than the help, but who raised a daughter who became a teacher, who raised me to become a doctor and researcher. She never lived to see me on the cover of Time magazine or receive the Presidential Medal of Science, but she knew that every generation should stand a little taller than the one before. I think about the generations of black women who swallowed their pride and endured humiliation so that their children and grandchildren could have better opportunities. They faced far worse than what I experienced at the bank, and they did it with grace and dignity that inspires me every day. But I also think about the choice I made that day, not to swallow my pride, not to accept treatment that was unacceptable, and not to let the moment pass without consequence. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to accept being made small. The truth is, success doesn't insulate you from racism. Education doesn't protect you from discrimination. Achievement doesn't shield you from the assumptions people make about you based on your appearance. But what success, education, and achievement can give you is the platform and the power to fight back when you face injustice. And that's what I learned that day at the bank. They judged me by my skin color, assumed I was somehow unworthy of their respect, and tried to make me prove my worth simply for existing in their space. But I showed them, and more importantly, I showed everyone watching, that we don't have to accept that treatment. We don't have to make ourselves smaller to make others comfortable. We don't have to prove our worth to people who have already decided we're worthless. The real victory wasn't in the apology or the policy changes or the media coverage. The real victory was in the refusal to accept the unacceptable. It was in the choice to use my voice not just for myself, but for every black woman who has been made to feel like she doesn't belong in spaces where she has every right to be. Because in the end, they didn't just judge me by my skin, they underestimated the strength of my spirit, the power of my voice, and the depth of my commitment to justice. And that, more than any professional accolade or scientific breakthrough, is what I'm most proud of. The bank saw a black woman and assumed she was less than. What they didn't see was a woman who had spent her entire life proving that assumption wrong, not just through her achievements, but through her unwavering belief in her own worth and the worth of every person who looks like her. They thought they could make me small. Instead, I used that moment to make the conversation bigger, the movement stronger, and the path forward clearer for the next generation of black women who will face similar challenges. Because that's what we do. We take the moments when others try to diminish us, and we use them to become more powerful, more vocal, and more committed to ensuring that the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we've fought. Every time a black woman stands up to discrimination, she's not just fighting for herself. She's fighting for the little girl who will walk into that bank 20 years from now and expect to be treated with dignity and respect. She's fighting for the teenager who will apply for her first job and won't have to worry about being judged by her appearance. She's fighting for the college graduate who will walk into that corporate boardroom and won't have to prove she belongs there. The change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. It happens one conversation at a time, one policy change at a time, one person at a time choosing to do better. It happens when we refuse to accept the unacceptable and demand the respect we deserve. They judged me by my skin. I showed them the unbreakable strength of my soul. And in doing so, I hope I showed other black women that their souls are unbreakable too. Because we are more than their assumptions. We are more than their limitations. We are more than their small-minded expectations. We are doctors and teachers, scientists and artists, mothers and leaders. We are the daughters of women who survived slavery and segregation. We are the granddaughters of women who built communities with their bare hands. We are the great-granddaughters of women who fought for freedom when freedom seemed impossible. And we are not going to be made small. Not today. Not ever. The next time someone tries to question your worth, remember that you don't need their permission to exist in any space. You don't need their approval to be excellent. You don't need their validation to know your value. Stand tall. Speak up. Refuse to accept the unacceptable. And know that when you do, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us. Because that's how change happens. One voice at a time. One stand at a time. One refusal to be made small at a time. They thought they could judge me by my skin. Instead, I showed them the power of standing in your truth, the strength of refusing to be diminished, and the unbreakable spirit of a black woman who knows her worth. And that knowledge, that refusal to be made small, that commitment to justice and dignity, that is something they can never take away.